Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I don't intend to speak long. I want to give a few explanations. NATO is not a cultural organization. That doesn't mean we're not cultured, but of course we are a security organization. We're an organization which is controlled politically, guided politically, an organization which has a very developed military capability. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to learn and we don't want to understand what security in its broadest sense means. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen many, many developments, but I think one of the most significant developments has been the way that the international community has understood security. We currently in NATO are leading the most significant operation we've ever led. We have over 100,000 troops from 46, soon to be 47, even 48 different countries in Afghanistan, under, and this is very important, United Nations mandate and demand. We are not there primarily and exclusively to pursue a military agenda. We see our role as being part of what's called a comprehensive approach, an approach where all international institutions have a contribution to make to the wider building of security in Afghanistan. We see our role as helping the Afghan government develop the capacity to deal with its own problems and be responsible to its own people. Because as we've already heard from Mr. Jalali, it's only the Afghans can bring peace in Afghanistan. But in a way, it's only the Afghans who have a government which they trust, which they believe will remain in power and capacity to provide security for the Afghan people. It's only the Afghans with a government which they trust and which is competent that will bring that security. And so we are doing basically two things. Of course, in the south and the east, where the insurgency is its most virulent, NATO forces are taking the brunt of the insurgency. They're taking the lead because there is no, as yet, strong enough Afghan army, Afghan police to do so. But that doesn't mean that we're working in isolation, because every NATO operation, particularly in the south and the east, now has Afghan forces with it, and even in some cases taking the lead operationally. This is one part of what we're doing. The other part of what we're doing in some ways is more important, which is helping build the Afghan National Army, and with other institutions like the European Union, trying to build up the Afghan police. And certainly the growth of the Afghan army has been significant over the past few years. And when I first went to Afghanistan as a political advisor to NATO and British forces in the south in 2007, there were only a handful of Afghan army personnel or police available to accompany British forces doing operations. Now almost every operation has formed units, capable units, operating with us. So on the one hand, the insurgency is being confronted, stemmed. On the other hand, more importantly, the key focus of our operation is to build up Afghan capacity. So that's what we're doing in Afghanistan. As I said, it's part of what we call the comprehensive approach. And I know that sounds like technical jargon. It sounds like the sort of phrases politicians, civil servants put into communiques and documents. But in fact, it is quite a concrete approach. We've defined the comprehensive approach in Afghanistan as having three main separate elements. One is governance, one is development, and the third is security. And the key point about the comprehensive approach is the recognition that security alone is not sufficient to develop conditions where the Afghan government can take responsibility. We have to pursue security alongside development and improvement to governance. That doesn't mean that NATO itself does development or governance, but NATO does have, in 32 provinces in Afghanistan, something called the Provincial Reconstruction Teams, which sometimes are military, sometimes are civilian. They're the means by which both NATO and their national sponsors, Germany has one, of course, in Kunduz, provides assistance to the local governor and to the local administration. But again, for our purposes, the important point about this comprehensive approach is that today security is not conceived as primarily a military achievable objective. And as Mr. Jalali said, that doesn't mean you can dispense with the military. You have to have security, but it does mean that this military presence has to have strong cooperation, strong unity of effort from other organizations, other efforts to build the capacity of the Afghan government. I would say we're in Afghanistan, if one looks about the development of the approach to security, a long way from the Dayton Accord 15 years ago, which ended the war in Bosnia. Those of you who follow what happens in the Balkans, the Dayton Accord basically had 9, 10, even 11 annexes, if I remember correctly, at the end of it, which designed specifically what should be achieved by different organizations. It made a separation of tasks, division of labor, and then it, though successful in itself, it didn't have this idea at the heart of it that somehow there had to be cooperation and a comprehensive approach to developing the stability within that country. And I think we're a long way from that position in Afghanistan, where under the aegis, under the lead of the United Nations, in my experience, and I've been in the Balkans, in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have a greater level of cooperation among institutions, coordination, than I've experienced elsewhere. It's not perfect, there are flaws, there are difficulties, there are some fundamental issues about whether some civil organizations, even some parts of the UN, want to cooperate with the military. But nevertheless, the level of comprehensiveness and unity of effort is greater now in Afghanistan than it's ever been. We in NATO, as I say, we're an organization which wants to encourage discussion. We're an organization which wants to learn. In November, we have a summit, the Lisbon Summit, which will set out our strategic approach and concept for the next few years, and we're in the process of developing our ideas. One of the things that we also hope to achieve by November is sufficient progress in some provinces in Afghanistan. And don't forget, not all provinces are unstable, not all provinces are faced with an insurgency. Sufficient progress so as to lead security responsibility to the Afghans and for the Afghan system to take full control, full responsibility for security and obviously governments in their own provinces. We can't guarantee that that will happen, but much effort is going into that. So it's not just about fighting the insurgency, it's also helping the Afghan government assume responsibility for areas, full responsibility for areas which are not subject to the same challenges, violence as in the south and the east. I will end by making a few personal comments that are entirely personal from my experience on the subject of this conference. As I said, I've been in several conflict or post-conflict areas, and I think this conference meets a very great need. It's always struck me that the cultural dimension is the one that the international community is the worst at, and even nations are the worst at, when they go into a country and try and help it stabilize. It's not that they don't care, it's just we don't have the instruments, we don't have the concepts, we don't have the ideas. And I'll just give you a few anecdotes just to illustrate it. I think Professor Dr. Schultz's presentation was excellent, brilliant in the way he talked about the need to understand Afghan society and the difficulty for outsiders to understand Afghan society. But I would add one comment. Another challenge for us all is to understand how the Afghans understand us, understand how the Afghans see us, because that in itself is a significant factor in how they react to our offers to assistance. I would say in the German case, you have a very positive basis for cooperation. I've spoken to many Afghans from different parts of the country, and they have a great admiration for Germany. Partly historical, after the First World War, Afghanistan turned towards Germany because of Afghanistan's mistrust of the British, and thought that the Germans would be a good partner to help develop their country and their society. But it's also because they admire your ability to reconstruct yourself after the Second World War and create a prosperous, peaceful society. They admire your technical means. They also admire the fact that among European nations, Germany was possibly the most generous of countries in receiving asylum seekers and refugees in the worst moments of its conflict. And so they remember that. Maybe Germany doesn't remember, but the Afghans do. There are other countries have different perceptions in Afghanistan, and I won't go into that, but it struck me that of all the things that we were preparing for when we were going into Afghanistan, the cultural side, was recognized as an important aspect. We received cultural advice and so on, but how the Afghans actually saw us, how they reacted to us, was never touched upon. And I remember speaking to one Afghan in the south, a tribal elder, and he said to me, "We don't understand what you, the internationals, are trying to achieve here." And I gave the usual talk about, well, we're trying to build capacity, build capacity in your government so that they can take responsibility. And he said, well, you can't eat capacity. And his ideas were very concrete. What are you doing to help us? And this gap in language and between us and them is quite significant and contributes to a degree of misunderstanding. And therefore, I would draw, in terms of the cultural dimension of what we're going to talk about over the next few days, I would draw three important points, or make three important points. The importance of legacy. When we go into a country, yes, we tend to have timelines where we want to develop it, want to create security. But we rarely think of what will these people think of us in 50 years' time? What will we leave behind which they can benefit from? Because we give the impression of being quick, that we want to do things quickly, but they remember much more than we do about what we've done right and what we've done wrong. I think there's also the importance of affinity, how sympathetic they are to different countries, how they feel that those countries are sympathetic towards them. And of course you will get more from a country, from a people, if they believe that your interests are aligned with theirs. And I think also the importance of civil society. Again, it's an area whose importance we're aware of, but again, the concepts and the framework for developing relations with civil society without offending the government, without making mistakes about contacting the wrong elements within society, again, that's something you have to discover on the ground. And so this sort of conference, which I think is very important, will help us understand better. I say NATO is an organization which is primarily security, but security is not primarily military. We want to learn and we want to understand. So thank you very much.
Mr. Williams has kindly agreed to also take some of your questions and interventions. So I'd warmly welcome any questions or interventions you might have. And I would ask you if you could please respect our rule as earlier this week, 30 seconds, just to allow for as many questions as possible. Please.
Hi, we met earlier, Nick. Professor Colin Evans, Euclid. I worked last night after the UFO. I don't know if anybody else did. Hillary Clinton somewhat belatedly abandoned some of the Bush doctrines, namely the abandonment of unilateralism, abandonment of preventive wars, abandonment of democratic regime change as a strategic aim, concentration on diplomacy, concentration on economic stability, and has declared it herself as it being interested, which is something we were discussing yesterday when you weren't here, that the United States is still as powerful, it's just using that power in a different way. The US, of course, is the leading NATO state. How do you see that change in US policy is going to affect the NATO mission in Afghanistan?
And maybe we'll take a few questions together, is that okay?
Yes, I'm conscious there are very distinguished speakers after me, so I don't want to take any time.
All right, we'll group a few questions, and then I'll give maybe a response to them together, please.
Hi, my name is Michael from the UK. You talked about affinity in your closing words there, just talking about national interests and things like that. What we're seeing now is, ISAF nations are losing more and more troops and spending more and more money. They find it necessary to justify the war in terms of national interest. For example, in Britain, where I come from, you're hearing more and more the justification as opposed to we want to help Afghanistan. Now it's we don't want to help Afghanistan. It's about our national security. So I was just wondering how you can balance that, or how you can deal with that within NATO, reconciling national interests, so that we don't just see Afghanistan as an instrumental relationship rather than a communicative one.
Thank you. Maybe a few more 30-second questions. I see in the front.
About 2 years ago, as a member of the European Council for Peace Development in the Balkans, I had the opportunity to travel from Belgrade, Serbia, across Kosovo, and there witnessed and saw all the NATO contingents from different nations, which made me realize how much money was being spent on peacekeeping and how little money was being spent on peacemaking. And therefore I welcome the association today to see NATO getting involved in, with this Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, which seems to me to go a certain way in the area of peace making.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Anne. I'm from the UK. Do you think that Britain, for example, should be buying opium for medicinal drugs from Afghanistan? Because we've gone into the country, but as you said, they can't eat capacity, but they could certainly use the money. Thank you.
Mr. Williams?
Well, thank you. I will answer very briefly. Some of these are highly political, and as effectively a servant of the whole organization, I can't actually give you a position contrary to any of the national positions that make up the 28 countries of NATO. But I will try my best to answer the questions as honestly and directly as possible. Obviously, a change in administration as significant as the one in the United States will affect the balance of decision-making, balance of policy within the alliance. And obviously, the United States, who now provide over 50% of the troops in Afghanistan, will have the biggest say in our policy towards Afghanistan. President Obama made a significant speech at the end of last year in which he set out his aims for Afghanistan, and in practice what has happened, despite defining the aim in Afghanistan more precisely in terms of terrorism and preventing more terrorism, preventing Afghanistan becoming a haven for terrorists and terrorism again. In practice, the means for achieving that have not changed all that significantly. In fact, significant additional resources have been devoted, both US and other resources, to Afghanistan. And in a way, the more precision in the objective has led to a more precision in the means to achieve it. Because with that precise objective came the understanding that we have to, and the US in particular, has to help the Afghan government, has to have a partner in the Afghan government which is capable of fulfilling its responsibilities in security and towards its own citizens. That in the end, it's only Afghans, as Mr. Jalali said, who can secure Afghanistan. And so in practice, there has not been any change in the comprehensive approach. There's been additional means, additional commitment, and a little less vagueness. Now, I know the counter-narcotics issue has been raised both in your speech and in the question. And certainly the policy on counter-narcotics fluctuated over time. But I think at the moment, the international community is united on a policy which is based on a strategy developed with and agreed by the Afghan government, which has many pillars. And the strategy is not just about eradication, although eradication is a part of the strategy. It's also about education. It's about substitution, alternative livelihoods. It's about reducing demand within the country. It's about a whole series of things, law enforcement, which, as I say, the idea is unity of purpose. What ISAF does and NATO does, following decisions by its defense ministers in 2008, is to support Afghan government law enforcement means where there is a connection between drug trafficking and the insurgency in order to help eliminate or prevent the development of particularly drug and narcotics facilities. So on the question as to whether anyone should buy this crop, I'm not an expert. The policy generally is that it shouldn't. Most people believe it will not be helpful. The current strategy has led very gradually to a reduction in the number of provinces where poppy opium is grown. Gradually. So the poppy growing areas are confined more or less to the significant poppy growing areas are confined to the south and the east where the insurgency is its most virulent. So the Afghan government has had successes following the current strategy. It's taken other countries many decades to deal with this problem, and a quick fix purchase will, many people believe, lead to a significant increase in production later on, because you add an additional value to growing the crop. How do you balance the need for governments to explain their presence in Afghanistan for national purposes against what is obvious to success? You have to persuade the Afghans that you're there to help them, not to help yourself. I don't think it's totally incompatible. I do think that the way it's been done so far, and again the way President Obama did it, which is to say, yes, we have a national interest, but it's not going to be pursued narrowly, because a narrow pursuit of that national interest will not serve that interest. It will not solve the problem. You have to continue to help develop Afghan government capacity and develop Afghan society infrastructure so that the country becomes less of a potentially failed state. So I don't think it's impossible. It's unfortunate, though, because Afghans follow what's going on in the world much more than we think, and every statement, particularly by the British, for cultural reasons, are followed, misinterpreted, misunderstood. So again, it's the use of language. And in terms of much more money being spent on peace keeping and peacemaking, well, as I said at the beginning, NATO, because of Cold War reasons, has the most developed military instrument among all international communities. When things go wrong, and certainly in a period from 1995 up until recently, the idea was that the military could do more than actually they could alone. Then the international community tended to turn to the military as the only quickly deployable force to introduce some sort of break in the momentum of violence. And one of the lessons that we're taking from Afghanistan as well as other areas is that civilians, we're not as well organized, we're not as quick, we're not as reactive as the military. The military are organized, and although they may not have all the skills necessary to stabilize, but they can get there quickly and they can plan. Civilians, unfortunately, we don't have those skills because we're not organized for the purposes of deployment, for the purposes of helping countries in need. Yes, there are lots of UN agencies which can, but they're very specific. They're not as sufficiently ready, they don't train, they don't prepare, they don't have doctrines, and therefore the military becomes an instrument of substitution rather than of means. I think that's answered all the questions, and my apologies to my fellow speakers if I've taken too long. Thank you very much.